Back in 1996, I was working at a hospital on the outskirts of a large city. It was a newish hospital, but it was built on the grounds of a large Victorian insane asylum. The old Victorian building was still there, and still very much in use as a mental health facility. As part of the hospital buildings, there was accommodation for staff. Here's where it gets interesting. I was living alone in one of the flats in the new section of buildings. After I'd lived there a few weeks, I started to notice that every time I was just falling asleep, someone would shout my name. It didn't matter what time it was. After day shifts, night shifts, and general days off sofa napping, without fail, my name would be shouted. I could not determine whether the voice was male or female, but it wasn't a very deep voice. This was also associated with the two other occurrences. I had a bead curtain, which would spontaneously move, but in a way that looked like someone was running their hand across it, so it would undulate and ripple. Nothing like when the wind caught it. If I had a window open, the other was involving my phone. Back in those days, mobiles were rare, so I had an old-fashioned home phone with a bell, which would ring like an old-fashioned alarm clock when I got a call. So along with the curtain and the name calling, this phone would make a noise like someone had flicked the bell. There would be a sequence of 3 taps of the bell at random times. After a few weeks of getting increasingly tired because of interrupted sleep, I got irritated and spoke to the room. I firmly but politely explained the situation and requested that it let me sleep. I settled back down into bed and tried to get back to sleep. At the point I was falling asleep again, the voice changed to a shh. Exactly how you would comfort a child to sleep. This happened for a few days, and then everything stopped, and they were gone. I have no idea who or what it was, but it was real. I'm not a trucker, but I do work for a very large LTL freight company. One particular day a couple of months ago, we were running a light sort through our station at around 15,000 packages when we get an email from the hub about a trailer going to be late. Wonderful. So we started to prep for this late trailer, and then about an hour later we got another email saying that the trailer wouldn't be showing up as there was an accident. We figured the highway was closed down and the trailer wouldn't make it anytime soon. Turns out the truck in front of the truck pulling our trailer had a loose brake drum. It fell off, bounced on the ground, and went right through the window, killing our driver instantly. Like most people, I've never been a big fan of hospitals. Sure, I appreciate that they're there, but I never want to be in one. I guess most people don't. This story happened about 10 years ago, when I lost my grandfather. It wasn't looking good. He'd got cancer, and at his age, with the conditions that he had previously, chemo seemed like a very poor choice, and he opted to just sit it out, enjoy his final days, be with his family, and let it take him. He wanted to go in peace. He was 89 years old, mind you, so he'd seen his fair share of life and the world. Still, it's not an easy thing knowing that you're about to die, nor is it easy on all your family. My grandmother was taking it specifically very hard. We're all gathered around the bed, holding his hand, talking to him, reliving old memories, and he seems to be so with it. It seems like there's almost nothing wrong, that the cancer isn't real, that there's nothing in his head, and that we can just walk out together and go back home. but it really isn't. From day to night, something happened, and it got bad. The day before, he was talking, chatty, happy, eating, and then the next day, everything changed. It was like his head had started to melt. He'd open his eyes briefly, mutter something, and close them again. I wasn't really sure what to do. If this was the end or not, or if he was just having an episode and would be back. None of us knew what was going on. It wasn't until 3 days after, when I went back, did the doctor take me aside to a room and explain to me that he was reaching the end of his life. They said that he'd be out by the week. I started to cry. I wasn't ready to lose my grandfather. Is anyone ever ready to lose someone in their life? No. The next 3 days, all of the family stayed. We called off work, we called off school, and any other commitment, and made sure that he knew we were there. What made it more painful is seeing him in that bed, almost like a husk, empty and lifeless, occasionally managing to babble out a few words, and then seemingly drifting off to sleep again. His eyes would never fully open. They'd remain almost always closed. I held his hand and tried to talk to him. I asked him to move if he understood me, if he was hearing me, but received no movement. It pained me so much to see what he was going through. I couldn't bear it. That same night, we were all sitting around, some of us asleep, as it was about 2 a.m. at the point. I was there with him, holding his hand, dozing off on a plastic chair. And then, I feel it. I was pretty sure he had gone. The warmth in his hand had ceased. We called for a doctor, and he came in, but that was it. My grandfather had officially passed away. His eyes were already closed. We said our final goodbyes, and it was the painful moment when he was taken away and out of sight. That hospital, for reference, is the only one in our town. It's relatively big for the area that we live in, and is the biggest one for miles around, so it takes people from everywhere in the area. That was it. He had moved on. It was a lovely funeral, and of course we all cried. Of course the story doesn't end there though. No. 5 years later, I was in a horrific car accident. I'm gonna be honest, it was entirely my fault. I was running late for an appointment, on my cell phone, and trying to drive at 80 on the motorway. I didn't see the other cars slowing down for the traffic, and I rammed right into the back of another vehicle, although I slowed down just in time for the crash not to be life-threatening. I'm so grateful that the guy in front of me was alright. I don't think they found out that I was on my phone, but damn, I was in a lot of pain. I was transported to the same hospital, no doubt, and I was pretty confident that I was going to reach the end of my life. I remember blacking out and waking up many, many hours later. My arms and legs had been heavily damaged, as well as my body itself. I wasn't sure what they'd done to me at this point, but I was just coming in and out of consciousness. As I was doing so, I looked up to see the doctors. My vision was blurred, and it was at that very moment that I swear I saw my grandfather. Now keep in mind I was probably heavily medicated, but why would I picture him at such a tragic moment? I was just thinking about how stupid I was, and how I was going to tell my family, and then all of a sudden he's standing there, behind the doctors, moving his head, trying to get a better look at me. I close my eyes again, and wake up hours later. The room is empty, and it's just me, listening to the sound of machines behind me. I try to move, but the pain is indescribable. Turns out I'd shattered both my legs, and the airbag had done some serious damage to my chest. Not to mention my head was all bloodied, and cuts were all over my body. I'm so grateful that I didn't have to get anything amputated. I lay there in the silence, listening to the bleeps all around me. I passed out again, and then I had the strangest dream. I was with my grandfather, and we were just talking, the way we used to. He was telling me about his latest fishing trip, and at one point he interjected. He stopped talking and said, "You can't come with me." I didn't know what he was talking about, and he said, "I'm sorry I'm not around anymore, but my time came. Stay strong. You'll be alright. You'll come out of this. You're my big boy, okay?" That's what he used to call me when I was small. All of this came out of nowhere in the dream, and just like that, I woke up. The room was dark and empty. I'm not sure how to explain this. Was it paranormal? Was it just my mind trying to comfort me, piecing together the fact that I may or may not have seen the ghost of my grandpa in the hospital? I don't know. I never did see him again, and although I did recover eventually, the feelings and thoughts never went away. I did look after my grandma, and she's still alive and kicking today. I just want to say thank you for giving me strength, Grandpa. You really don't know how much that helped me go through everything. I don't know if it was all in my head, but it meant the world to see you one last time, and to know that you were with me in my darkest hour. And for those of you interested, I lost my license and haven't driven since. It's okay though. Buses are cool. To cut a long story short, we broke up and she kept sending me nudes. Then one day just stops and acts like I'm the worst person in the world. She wouldn't give me the rest of my belongings back or my dog. Finally, I did get the dog back after 2 months, after putting her on blast on social media. Oh, and then 6 months later, she logged into my PayPal and sent herself $75. Oh, and at some point, she logged into my Slacker radio account and deleted all the playlists I curated for years, and added all Christian music and kid music. In 2003, my son and I took a long trip out west to see national parks and tourist attractions. We drove 6,800 miles in 19 days. We were driving north to the Grand Canyon, and an ambulance passes us, lights and sirens going full. A few miles up the road, we see a debris field on the side of the road ending in a minivan with no door, about 100 feet off the road. Their seats are clearly visible inside and intact. On the road is a body of a woman, well dressed, with a cloth over her face. The ambulance is there with a couple of cars that have stopped, and everyone was standing around looking uncomfortable. Clearly the woman rolled her van and was ejected. No seatbelt, obviously. This was at 8:30 AM on a clear day and nearly no traffic on the road. I've often wondered what she was doing. Putting makeup on, talking on a cell phone, changing the radio, putting in a CD. Whatever it was, it caused her to crash. A lot of the debris looked like marketing material, pamphlets, racks, stuff like that. Where was she going? To give a presentation? It all ended suddenly on the side of the road. Wear your seatbelts, people. As my dad is finishing his last few days of treatment and rehab, I went to the facility he's in to visit him for Father's Day. Up until a few days ago, he was in a facility in Jamestown for several months. It sits next to the North Dakota State Hospital. Somehow, we started talking about paranormal stuff and his experiences there. A short history on this hospital. It opened in 1885 and became an institution for the mentally ill and criminally insane. Within the next couple of years, overcrowding became a huge problem, so the hospital was forced to expand multiple times, while also being severely understaffed. In 1937, the governor fired the institution's superintendent and 75% of the staff and rehired new people in their place because of their political contributions. After this, the new staff were very underqualified to care for the patients and treated them badly by cussing and abusing them, and probably killing them. By 1947, the news of overcrowding, neglect, malnutrition, seclusion, including many tuberculosis patients, hit the news, and by 1953, reforms started happening, and things started getting better. By 1974, the population dropped from over 2,000 in the 1940s to about 600, and about 200 today. And yes, the place is still in operation. Today, the hospital now serves as a place for psychiatric services, transitional living, and treatment for chemical dependency. Thank you, Wikipedia. My dad liked to stay busy over there, so he would always take jobs or helped out in any way he could. From my understanding, the hospital was kind of like a partner institution for his rehab place, but the people were more like inmates, where he could leave and had much more freedom. He went to the side of the hospital that acts as a prison today and helped one of the ladies who works there with the laundry. They folded tons of sheets, towels, and went downstairs for something, and when they came back for the sheets, they were thrown on the floor and all messed up. Keep in mind that everything there stays locked up, so nobody could have been in there to do that. The lady told my dad that it was Charlie, the ghost in that part of the prison. Apparently he does stuff like that all the time. The lady told my dad that they have names for the different ghosts all around the prison, because there are so many of them. They even have a few rooms that they had to block off, because any time a resident/inmate would move into them, they would refuse to go back, because so much creepy stuff happened, that they would just end up having to move them to a different room. Even the old warden's office was so haunted that he told them if they couldn't find him a new space for his stuff, he was going to quit his job and move on. My dad said apparently things would move all around and go flying off the shelves. Since he was able to leave frequently and have a job outside the facility while he was there, he and a couple of guys took a local job doing weed whipping or lawn stuff on the hospital grounds and the cemetery. He was working with a small crew of guys in the middle of the afternoon. The part of the hospital grounds they were working on are no longer in operation, but the building they were by had lots of windows so you could see everything inside. He and another guy saw someone walking around in there, so they let their boss know that someone else was working there too. Nah, nobody works there. Nobody's been in there for years, his boss said. They joked around about seeing a ghost and came to learn that paranormal activity is super common there. My dad is a no BS kind of guy, but he and the other guys saw him so clearly that they could see his clothes and everything. What did you see him wearing? The other guys said to my dad in a super scared voice. Yeah, my dad said, someone's messing with us. That was a person. They kept working even though they were creeped out. Then they saw him again. My dad said the same apparition came walking really fast down the hallway towards them. They could still see it in the window, and darted around the corner into the garage. He was wearing an old-timey black and white suit with a hat to go, and he kept his head down like he was trying to hide his face from them. The guy with my dad took off running and said he was done working there because he was so scared. But my dad yelled at him to run around the front so that they could catch the guy who was trying to freak them out. They went around to all possible doors and absolutely no one was there. Somehow the boss ended up getting the keys so they could investigate in that part, and my dad said it was so dusty that they could see their footprints, and the only footprints they saw in there were their own. So there was zero chance that there was any trace of the man. My dad told me he knows for a fact that the place is haunted as hell. That guy must have been doing some shady stuff, because he kept ducking away from us and hiding his face. A couple of street bikes buzzed by us speeding. A few miles later, on a connecting interstate, we saw hundreds of flashing lights, and we couldn't tell if it was an accident scene or construction or what. Since I was new, my dad asked me to pull over and switch with him. I got out and saw the bottom half of a human leg still in its shoe on the ground next to us. Further up the road, one of the motorcyclists had fallen off and got run over by a pickup truck. Damn gruesome. I'm a night shift nurse in a hospital in North Carolina. Before I tell my story, let me give you some background information about my hospital. There are 4 floors in total. The ground floor contains the lobby, gift shop, cafeteria, pharmacy, and outpatient services. The first floor has the lab, ICU, ER, and the vending machines. The second floor, where I work, is the med-surg hall. Finally, the third floor is mostly conference rooms and HR. In the past, the first floor contained our OB and L&D, and pediatrics. These floors closed due to a lack of demand in the community. Most nights, I have my routine pat down. I eat my lunch at midnight between medication passes and get hungry again around 3 AM. Naturally, I run down to the vending machines and on the first floor for a snack. There are vending machines by the ICU and ER, with a long hallway cutting through the empty pediatric ward separating them. The vending machine in the ICU was out of order, so I decided to cut through the peds and grab a snack from the other. As I walked down the dim stretch of hallway, I heard a noise. Upon further inspection, it sounded like a child's laughter. Being the prudent nurse that I am, I started searching rooms to make sure that no child was just wandering a smuck in the dark. I checked each room and saw no one. No TVs were on in any room. I brushed it off as my imagination and continued my trek to the other vending machine. On my way back though, I heard the noise again and felt something tugging on the bottom of my scrub top. I broke out in a cold sweat and booked it for the elevator without turning back. When I mentioned it to the more seasoned nurses on the unit, they mentioned that no one else goes down there by themselves for that exact reason. It is common knowledge that patients pass away in the hospital, and many nurses believe that some lost souls wander the corridors looking for companionship. My grandfather was a trucker, and said that back in the 60s, it was pretty much the Wild West out there on the roads. Another truck had been giving him shit, and running him off the road damn near and whatnot. Well, it being how it was back then, he pulled out the old .45 and let off a few rounds into the trailer to get back at him. It worked, but he ended up in jail, bailed out, and skipped out of that town. He has been a trucker for all his life and has a ton of other stories, but that one stood out to me the most. I had just turned 19 and was about a month into my sophomore year in college, 4 hours away from home. I had been feeling very ill for days, and after being misdiagnosed by the campus health center with strep throat, I didn't even have a sore throat, I finally asked a friend to take me to the local ER. I was admitted immediately with a severe kidney infection. I would later find out, from reading my medical records, that doctors were concerned I had a heart attack due to my crazy high blood pressure and heart rate. I was in so much pain, but hadn't been given anything besides a shot of Taradol, basically super ibuprofen, in the ER at 10 AM. It was now 7 PM, and I hadn't been seen by any doctors since being admitted, as they were waiting for a specialist to get there. This is when the situation turned paranormal. I was in the hospital bed, and my friend that had driven me was sitting next to me in a chair, keeping me company. Suddenly at the foot of my bed, a woman just kind of materialized. I quickly realized I was seeing my nonny, my mother's mother, who died when I was 5 years old. I went wide-eyed thinking of all the stories I'd heard from nurses that say that when patients start seeing deceased loved ones, they wind up dying shortly after, and it's like their loved ones who came to escort them over to the other side. My nonny was wearing a blue muumuu, which she had approximately 1 million of those type of dresses in rainbow of colours. She just smiled at me reassuringly, and disappeared as quickly as she had appeared. I asked my friend if she just saw a woman at the foot of my bed, and she told me no, and looked at me as if I was going nuts. Now, of course, this may have just been some kind of hallucination from the insane amount of pain I was on, as once I saw a doctor, I was on the good stuff for a week, and that's what skeptics explain it away as. But I really think my nonny visited me. I have further evidence that it was her, or that there was some insane coincidence afoot in the hospital. See, the doctor finally came in to see me at around 10 PM. I did a double take when he walked in. This man looked exactly like my nonny's husband, my papa. He died when I was 3, but I remember him, and of course we have pictures. My mum came to visit me and had tears in her eyes when she met this doctor, because she said he could have been her father's twin. So I of course told my mother about seeing Nonny, and she agreed with me, especially after seeing the doctor that looked just like her father. It really seemed like her mother had come to pay me a visit. I was seriously ill. The staff later told me they didn't think I would make it, especially after not responding to antibiotics for the first few days. Some of them even told me they prayed for me. Hell, even the very kind custodian that cleaned my room told me she prayed for me, because she saw how miserably ill I looked. So we now think Nonny visited because she knew how poorly I was, and she knew how scared I was. So she wanted to comfort me. When I was very little, and was ill with a cold or sore throat or something like that, I always wanted her to be the one to take care of me, and make me her special soup. I think she knew I needed her comfort and reassurance, so she found a way to provide that, even after death. Right out of high school, I went to visit my boyfriend in the military. How my parents let me go, I will never know. So we get a motel for the week, and we proceeded to spend the entire time in the room, as two kids who haven't seen each other in months will do. On the 5th day or so, we get back to the motel for dinner, and find that the room below us is taped off with police tape, and surrounded by cop cars. We assume drug deal or prostitution or something like that, and don't think anything else of it. Well, after my week is up, I'm in a cab on the way to the airport, and hear something about the Sunset Inn Motel on the radio. It turns out a Marine killed his wife there, drove to Texas, and was killed in a police shootout, and they found the body 3 days after she was murdered. For context, I am a female. This year, my favourite cousin was getting married in Canada. My trip involved a layover in China, where I was provided hotel and accommodation. At this point in the year, it was super hot in China. The problem was the air conditioning wasn't working, along with all the electronics, Wi-Fi, PowerPoint supply and the like. I called the front desk to tell them of this problem, and one of their employees was sent up to try and fix it, but to no avail. After 30 minutes, I told him it was fine, and I just wanted him to go, because I'd been exhausted from all the travelling and lack of sleep. Fast forward to some point in the night. I woke up, which isn't that uncommon for me, but I heard something. In my dazed state, I saw someone at the end of my bed sitting. At first I thought it was my cousin, and told him he could sleep on the couch. But then it hit me. At the end of my bed was the same man who had been sent up to fix the problem in my room. He was just sitting there, and undressing himself. At first I couldn't say or do anything. I just thought in my head, this is what happens to solo travellers, and prepared myself for the worst. But then I thought, screw this, and screamed my heart out. The man got startled and ran away. I ran up to lock the doors and thought it was pointless since he probably had a key card and could get back into my room anyway. I ended up spending the rest of the night awake, staring at the door. When morning hit, I tried to tell the front desk about it, but there was just a huge language barrier, plus my crying didn't really help. Then I noticed the guy who was in my room in the background, and I started shouting and pointing at him. They still couldn't really understand, and in the end, all they could tell me was sorry, and that he was drunk and thought it was his room. Not me, but my mum's friend's husband was a truck driver, and was on the highway one night. He was driving along, and sees cars pulled over the side of the road, but doesn't think much of it, since that's fairly common to see. Well, the door swings open, and a guy jumps out in front of his truck and kills himself. My mum's friend ended up losing his job because of the guy, and it really messed him up. So if you see a car pulled to the side, try and get into the far lane as soon as possible, not only for other people's safety, but for yours as well. This story happened to me when I was in my local hospital. I had been working for an underground utility company, and we were building a hiking trail and putting in pipes for a new nature park. The park was designed so that all of the reclaimed and cleaned water from the sewage plant would be pumped into swamps to refurbish the swamps that were now almost dry. The swamp would naturally finish cleaning the water and create a new habitat. So in order to do this, we built new lift stations to the plant to collect the clean water to be pushed to the swamps. So I had been working sealing the concrete underground storage tanks that were on the first lift station, and was testing for leaks. Naturally, it's unavoidable to not get any water on you. The water is clean enough to be put into a swamp, but certainly not for human consumption. I got splashed pretty heavily, and for a few days later became very ill. I went to my local hospital, that is very old, and to the point is basically just what I call a big boo-boo stop. They can handle minor problems, but most bigger issues they send you to bigger hospitals. So my wife and I are sitting in one of the ER rooms, and they have given me an IV of fluids and antibiotics. It's a 2-bedroom with the curtains, and they have the lights turned off, because they bought a woman that's experiencing a migraine. They come in and take her for a scan. I'm laying in my bed facing that side of the room. My wife is sitting beside me trying to comfort me, because whatever it was that had me sick is causing excruciating stomach pain. Everything is very quiet, and we live in a very small town, with a census of 590. So other than the medical staff, there were maybe 4 patients in the ER. All of a sudden, we both hear from behind the curtain a female voice that's very raspy say, "Oh God, help me." My wife looks at me and I say, "Ma'am, are you okay? Do we need to call a nurse?" My wife goes, "Didn't they just come and get her a few minutes ago?" So we sit in uncomfortable silence, when suddenly again we hear, this time more urgently, "Please someone help me, save me." My wife jumps up and starts going over to the curtain, because we see it moving like someone's behind it. She jerks the curtain back, and no one's on the other side. We're naturally freaking out. I hit the call button and a nurse comes in. We know her, so we tell her what happened. She just plainly states, "Yeah, that happens sometimes, I'm sorry." She then goes, "But at least you're not here at night, when the kids we hear and see come out to play." Creepiest day at the hospital I've ever had, and I couldn't get out of there fast enough. A trucker purposefully hit my best friend's uncle while he was on a motorcycle. The trucker ran his pockets, took his ID and his plates, and left him for dead on the road. Even though he was mangled beyond recognition, he was conscious and begged the trucker to leave some ID behind, so his family wouldn't be left to wonder what happened. The trucker laughed and drove away. Somehow he survived, but paralyzed from the neck down. Oddly, my friend's father is also a trucker. The world has been so cruel to that family. I used to rent out an apartment in a complex called the Beacon in New Jersey. It was 4 to 5 buildings that used to be a hospital center. It's also famous because the staircase scene in the Titanic movie, yes, that one, was filmed there. It's on the historical registry, so they can't change anything structural about the building, but they did a pretty good job of converting it into nice apartments. Now, my husband and I lived on floor B, the basement. Obviously, this place had problems. We still had windows and stuff, but technically, we were in the basement area. I don't know what our place was before, but I'm sure it was not the morgue. From what I heard, they didn't use that area for apartments, and it was in another building, thankfully. But still, the entire time we lived there were little things that happened that made us uneasy. This was a studio, and we had no pets, so there was a whole lot of space to be. Several times, I would feel what I thought was my husband getting into bed. You know, you feel the blankets move and the bed goes down. I would roll over, and he would be working or in the bathroom. Sometimes this would happen, and I knew it wasn't him, because he was traveling for work. But I could feel something lay down and put their arm around me while I was half asleep. I'm not a cuddly person, so this wouldn't be a muscle memory thing. Obviously there were also little noises and bangs, but it's hard to attribute that to paranormal, since this is Jersey and almost everyone is an asshole neighbour. For the most part, it was just the bed thing and feeling watched occasionally. Nothing super scary or unnerving in my apartment, but I'm sure that the entire complex has weird stuff going on. My buddy's girlfriend's parents own a trucking business, and one of their drivers never showed up to his stop, and they couldn't get a hold of his phone. So they looked at the tracker and the truck, and he was in a truck stop in California. They called the police and they went to check it out. He had been robbed and shot in the process while parked overnight. The worst part was that it was his second to last run before he retired. The owners of the company knew him well and felt terrible because he didn't want the job, but they gave it to him anyway. Being in this career, you see many things the average 9-to-5 worker doesn't see. One night, just outside of a little town in southern Middle Tennessee called Tullahoma, we were traveling southbound, doing about 60. Just to set the scene a little better, it was around 2:30 a.m. The rural area, along with nothing but the sound of your locomotive, can be somewhat eerie. As we came over a hill onto a bit of flat land, I could vaguely see the lights of a car racing to the upcoming road crossing. At 60 miles an hour, you're on something before you know it. I'm blowing my horn way more than the normal 2 longs and 1 short, and a long through a crossing. I gave all the warnings I could. The car didn't stop. They always told me not to make eye contact with the person you're about to hit. I've also been told, during moments of extreme emotional distress, you remember in great detail what you saw. The split second of fear in her eyes was traumatizing. She was the most beautiful, dark-haired, blue-eyed beauty in a black dress I'd ever seen. They say real beauty is on the inside, but I must disagree, because the brain matter on my locomotive plow looked no way near as good as the woman that once possessed it. As part of a family trip, when I was about 8 years old, we stayed at the Columbia City Hotel in California. The place is a gold rush hotel, which is supposedly haunted, but it was for the general gold rush history that we were staying there. I remember hearing some sort of tour describing the ghostly activity to do with the miners and gold prospectors. But I wasn't part of the tour and was really just hanging out, waiting for my parents to finish checking in. That night, when we went to sleep, I had pretty much forgotten that the place was supposedly haunted. Sometime in the early morning, I awoke crying after a nightmare, which wasn't uncommon. Neither were night terrors, and I remember still being in the state between asleep and alert. While lying in my bed, I could faintly hear a soft woman's humming, which sounded like a lullaby, almost like what my mum might do. But I also noticed that it sounded very close when my parents were asleep on the other side of the room. I wasn't afraid, even when I heard a calming and soft, "Shh, go back to bed, sleepy baby." Still sleeping, I did actually drift off back to sleep. The next day, when I was chalking it up to a dream, I heard the tour again, talking about a young woman who in the gold rush era had stayed in a room. Apparently her child had died in infancy there, and she grieved it something fierce, enough that people claimed they still heard the infant's cries and her singing. I didn't know I had heard this part of the tour the day before, and hearing it after my night convinced me that what I had dealt with was not a dream. This story is from my brother. He was at a rest stop once and saw this middle-aged woman in a pink Jeep with 4 to 5 small dogs walking them. He continued about his routine and got into his truck and back onto the freeway. A few minutes down the road, the woman and her dogs goes flying past him, then suddenly makes a sharp left turn, hits the dirt median, and barrel rolls. He stops the truck and runs to check on her. There are dead dogs scattered all over. She is laying in a ditch of water with her head just above. She kept asking him incessantly if her dogs were okay. They were not. She was not okay either, as she couldn't get up. I worked at a hospital during transport for a couple of years. The transport home base was in the basement of the hospital, where all the laundry is done and supplies are also sorted there. I hated working late nights after this incident. One particular night, I was the only one in the basement when I heard whistling at the end of the hallway by the elevator. I poked my head around the corner, expecting to see my only co-worker on duty that night, but there was absolutely no one there. I shrugged it off. I'm not easily spooked. Nights are slow, so I ate some snacks and hung out in the break room for a bit. Next thing I know, I hear a loud bang. I walked into the hallway, and a bed is rolling down the hall, bumping into the sides. At this point, I think my co-worker is bullshitting me. I radio him, and he says he's upstairs in the cafeteria. I still don't believe him, and think I'll catch him in the act. I walk past the laundry room, and the machines start. I pop my head in expecting to find him, but it's completely empty. Okay, and I start to get a little nervous. I walk into the laundry room, and the machines stop completely. I freeze, then run out, and head towards the elevator when I hear the whistling again. At this point, I know I'm not the only worker in the basement. As I'm standing there waiting for the elevator, things start falling off the shelves down the hall. Boxes of gloves, tissues, packages of tubes. I'm literally standing there watching them all fall off one by one at the opposite end of the hallway. I shit you not. My entire body broke out in goosebumps. My hair stood on end, and I had this strong gut feeling I was being watched. I was not alone. As I'm getting to the elevator, I feel what feels like someone brushing my arm. I went upstairs and found my co-worker in the cafeteria, freaked him out, and got the hell out of there and transferred soon after that. The creepy thing to add to this is that I usually whistle mindlessly to myself at work. It was almost as if the spirit were mimicking me. Creepiest feeling ever. I was transferred to the operating room soon after that. I was part of an emergency C-section where a baby was lost. My co-worker and I occasionally heard a baby's cry in the hallway at night. The security officers have also witnessed some crazy things as well. So maybe a year or so later, I bought my first house. It was a 2-story wood-floored house that had been well loved and lived in. On the day it closed and the sale went through, I went there late at night after I'd gotten the key. I went upstairs into the master bedroom just in awe of this house that was mine, when I heard footsteps start at the bottom of the staircase and walk slowly up. I had bought my house from a family friend, so I assumed it was him. I walked to the staircase and say, "Hey Brendan," thinking it was him coming to celebrate with me. Of course, the staircase was empty. Fast forward to moving day. I'm moving my stuff in, and all day long I can hear footsteps going up and down the stairs. It got to the point where I actually got annoyed of it because it was so loud. A few days later, my sister and her husband moved in. That night, we could all hear the kitchen drawers and cupboards opening and closing, and a man and a woman's voice whispering. The worst part was the whispering. At first I thought I was being robbed, but when you turn the corner and all the noises stop and there's no one there? Creepy feeling. We had a priest come and bless the house soon after that. My brother-in-law refused to live there until it was taken care of, and he never believed in spirits or ghosts until this incident, and he thought I was crazy. My sister and I took a picture of the staircase one particularly noisy night, and there are orbs with faces on them. I'm being so honest here. I'll see if she still has it, because this was 5 years ago. I was driving northbound in Utah, heading to Brigham to deliver a load. I get past Ogden, and it just starts pouring like a Texas storm. It also happened to be 8 p.m. and is pitch black outside. I happened to roll by the scene of an accident, where a gentleman was hanging out the driver's side window of a 90s Tacoma, with a white sheet barely covering him, and covered in blood. His head was only half attached to his body. The tires of the truck were bald as hell, and given the pole that the truck was wrapped around, it was obvious what happened. Wear your seatbelts, people, and be safe. I don't want to see another semi-decapitation. I was stalked by an ex for about 6 or 7 months. After we broke up, he enrolled at my university. Now this university is huge. There are people I know who also attend the school, and I've never run into them once in 4.5 years. My ex found me on campus every single day. This really unsettled me, to the point where I made sure I didn't hang out in the same space too often. But he still found me. He was constantly blowing up my phone too. We had decided we would try and stay friends, but he took that to the next level. If I didn't answer every single text he sent within a very small amount of time, he'd call and scream at me, or call me names over text. He'd find my car around town and leave notes on my windshield. Finally, I exploded and told him to leave me alone. I'm a very quiet person, and he was not used to me standing up to him, so I guess it worked. He dropped out of the university and didn't try to contact me again. I blocked him on everything, just to be sure. When I was 5 years old, we had just moved to the airbase, and my dad was security forces. I wasn't old enough to go to the youth center, so some days my dad would take me with him to his office. The base was a former army fort, established during the days of the railroad, and had a lot of old buildings. My family lived in a newer development not that far away from the youth center. Many of the old buildings were turned into office space or housing. The old hospital buildings were converted into office space a long time back, and they were within a walking distance from my bus stop. I had to pass the old cemetery base on the way there, but that's a different story entirely. I remember my dad's office being on the 3rd floor, overlooking a parking lot, surrounded with large trees, and at the end of a long hallway. When I would go with him to his office, I had to be in there the entire time, or in the office, because I was a minor, and I couldn't reach the keypad for the elevators or the doors to the stairwell. It's a base, and everything is locked. I'd hear stories from him and my uncle about weird stuff happening in the building at night, when my uncle would come over for barbecue, but never thought anything of it. I was a kid after all. I didn't comprehend the concept of ghosts quite yet. One day my dad had to leave to go drop a file off at a different office in the building, 1 floor down, at the end of the hall. He said that he'd only be gone a minute. I wasn't too worried. I had my Bernstein bear book, my stuffed wolf, and a snack. He said he'd leave the door open this time so that I could get a drink, just in case. I said okay, and that was that. I listened to Dad walk down the hall, punch in the code on the door, and the door slammed behind him. Like a kid, I continued to goof around until I heard bootsteps in the hall. They were heavy and slow, like they didn't have a purpose and were just on a casual stroll. A man in uniform popped his head around the doorframe. I thought he looked funny. It wasn't any uniform I'd seen an airman wear. It's been so long, I can't remember what he looked like. But he smiled at me, and I waved like an idiot. "Good afternoon, little lady." He tipped his hat, chuckled, and kept walking. I waited to hear the sound of the doors unlock and slam shut, but it never came, and the sound of his feet stopped halfway down the hall. I continued on with my day, only realizing what I had experienced weeks later, after saying something offhand to my mum about the old thing. Needless to say, I refused to set foot into that brick building now. About 20 years ago, I was heading down to Snowshoe on I-80 in Pennsylvania. Flatbed passed me, and after he got about a quarter of a mile in front of me, the brake lights come on, and he started swerving all over, and ended up in the median, upright, but jackknifed into the driver's side. Turns out he hit a bear, which went through the windshield. Bear survived, and it went on attack mode. I and 2 other drivers got to him in time to see this bear flapping out inside the cab attacking this guy. Right behind us was a state trooper. He ran up to the truck, yanked the passenger door open, and shot the bear twice. The bear turned around and started towards him, and he unloaded into it. The guy was torn up, and no, he didn't make it. I used to work as a CNA. My shift would start at 2 p.m, and I was supposed to end at 11 at night. However, if I had to train the girl on nights, that meant I had to stay till 4:30 in the morning. Being a nurse tech is hard work, so you'd imagine by 2 or 3 in the morning, I was tired and sleep deprived. One night I was working a long shift. We did rounds every hour, so we were going through, and a resident requested a nurse. So we told the nurse she was wanted. Now, since we did rounds, that meant we checked on all residents. Typical night. They were all sleeping. We went back to the nurse's station and sat down. The nurse still in the same resident's room, talking low, very abruptly and loud. We heard the loudest baby cry. One of those cries where a mother just knows something was wrong. I shot up out of my chair and immediately tried to follow where we heard it. Odd thing, it came from everywhere. It didn't echo from hall to hall. It sounded as if the same noise came from all 3 halls surrounding us. I ordered my co-worker to check patients again. No change. Everyone asleep. I thought I was in denial, and kept asking my co-worker if she heard the same thing, and she agreed she did. We waited until the nurse came out of the resident's room, and asked if she heard it, and she had done as well, but didn't know how to react, being that she was with a resident and didn't want to freak them out. That place used to be a regular hospital with a morgue at the very bottom. Many nurses hated working nights due to the weird experiences that they would encounter. I'll never forget that baby's blood-curdling cry, nor can I explain it. I am a railroader. I've heard so many scary stories from different professions. I figured I should share my own. I'll start out by describing my area and the history for a little background. I am in the southeastern United States. We have a lot of Civil War battlegrounds and trackside graves. There's an area just south of Nashville called Chapel Hill, Tennessee. The story is at night, around midnight. You can see the lights of an old school swinging lantern with a headless corpse carrying it, walking down the tracks. The corpse of a man who was once a conductor, who was decapitated after falling off a moving train. Our locomotive cabs have 3 seats in them. The conductor left, the extra brakeman in the center, and the engineer to the right. I got called on a 2-man crew to the run to Chapel Hill. We rolled into town at about 11:50, and out of nowhere we went into an emergency. My conductor goes to walk the train line, leaving me alone in the cab. After about 10 minutes, all of my lights go out and come back on, and I see a figure standing on the tracks in front of our stopped train. Thinking it was my conductor, I leave my seat and go out to the cab door to see what's wrong. I get on the ground to see nobody anywhere around. I was freaked the hell out at this point, so I just got back on and sat down. At this point, I looked in my rear view mirror and saw a figure moving on my second unit. I radioed my conductor, asking where he was, just to hear that he was 30 cars back from me. I walked to the second unit to find nothing. At this point, I'm frustrated and creeped out, and basically stranded in the middle of nowhere on a haunted stretch of tracks. I go back to the lead locomotive, and a few minutes pass. I feel like I'm being watched, so I turn to the left to see a corpse with no head riding out of the conductor's seat, coming at me. I'm frozen in fear at this point. Right as it gets within a few feet of me, it just disappeared. I then saw a lantern swinging, moving away from my train. My conductor happened to see it on his way back and asked why I was outside with the lantern. I explained what happened as we got back on our way. But that was a freaky night. I was delivering newspapers in the morning when I come up to a street that's blocked off by the police. They inform me a total of 0.7 miles of road is closed off due to an accident. I later learned that in the middle of the night, a college girl was riding her bike without any lights on, and a truck driver didn't see her. He also didn't notice when he ran her over, and he ended up dragging her body to where he was going. The police had blocked off 0.7 miles of road because it was littered with body parts. This story comes from my dad, who was a security guard for a hospital in our small town. The hospital was built in 1908, established in a mining community, and then turned into a nursing home for miners. My dad had the responsibility of walking around and locking up the offices, and making sure no one else stood around after 10 p.m. There was a 3-story building. The bottom is where the basement and old morgue was, and the second floor being the meeting offices, kitchen, gym, dialysis center, and visitor bathrooms. The upper floor being where all the elderly residents stayed and were taken care of. He says he was walking on the second floor, locking up the bottom visitor door and checking offices for people around 11 p.m. He walked by the women's and men's visitor bathroom near the gym. As he was walking by, he heard a woman who hacked a very loud, obnoxious cough, ripped a paper towel from the dispenser, and then went quiet. He waited by the lady's door for someone to come out. However, no one did. He waited a little longer, and still nothing. He finally knocked on the door saying, "Ma'am?" No response. He slowly opened the door. The light was off, and it was only an echo that filled the hall when the door loudly squeaked open. He turned the light on. No one was there. He checked the 2 stalls and the small shower that was in there, all empty. When he glanced near the trash, he noticed a piece of torn paper towel, shriveled up and thrown in. He quickly walked out the restroom and left. To this day, he swears the cough was as clear as day, loud and eerie. He can't explain it, and he's a skeptic in the paranormal. But there are many other stories of personal experiences that I have also had in that same building. I am not a trucker, but I heard a crazy story from a buddy of mine when we were really young. There is this one large truck stop in the city that we live in, and we were getting our driving licenses, and they had to do on-the-road training with a driving instructor. The city is small enough that the instructors know a lot of the police in town, and as my buddy drove past the truck stop, they noticed a ton of police cars and emergency service vehicles. They stopped to say hello to the police, and one of them informed the driver and instructor that a driver got drunk and asked if they could show the kids what happened to people who drink around heavy machinery. He told me that a driver got royally messed up on booze and passed out behind a semi, and as the driver backed up in the morning, he squashed the drunk driver's head like a watermelon and had no clue about the entire ordeal until he was far out enough of his spot to see what he had done. Crazy. When I was about 12, my mother and father owned a tow trucking company. This particular day, they went to our neighbouring state, so I had a few friends over, and we were there alone. They probably came over at around 12 PM. We were doing the normal preteen stuff, watching movies, eating junk food. It was winter, so it started to get dark pretty quickly. We were expecting my mother and father to be home any time between 6 and 7. A little before my mum and dad were supposed to be home, there's a knock on my door. The way my house was set up, the front door was right next to my living room couch, where all of us were hanging out. Anywho, my mum is known for kind of being stuck in the 80s, and she always wore a leather jacket. One of my friends, Tina, looks through the window of the door and says, "It's your mum. I can see her jacket." I jump up immediately and look through my window. It's pretty dark at the time, and I don't see my father's tow truck. I run to the front door screaming to Tina, "Don't answer the door, it isn't my mum." But it was too late. She opens the door, and here comes this 6-foot, 250-pound man with a black stocking over his face, running through my door. All my friends ran out of my living room to the kitchen, where the back door is located, and ran away. Me, on the other hand, I obviously learnt that my fight, flight, or freeze response is to freeze. This man grabs a hold of me, picks me up into the air, and I am so scared. I actually peed my pants. I don't remember what happened, but I managed to escape his grip and run out of my back door and down the block to a neighbour's house. We called the cops, and within a couple of minutes there are 6 cop cars, 3 on each end of the block. And we come to find out it was my own grown-ass neighbour. He was allegedly trying to play a trick on us, a bunch of little girls. He was always a creep. To this day, as I'm 26 now, Whenever there's a knock on my door, I literally creep around my house so that people can't see or hear me, and I hide until they're gone. So, arsehole neighbour, let's never meet again, or I will punch you where it hurts. In 2005, when I was a kid, my family took a weekend vacation to San Francisco. I loved the experience and all of the sights we saw, but sadly, the hotel we stayed at did not live up to its internet rating. It was supposed to be a grand 5-star shindig, but we got there to find it was a rundown old building, had bullet holes in the windows, and the television looked like it probably aired the Kennedy assassination. So the first night we're there, me and my 3 brothers all pile into the bedroom, while my mum and dad slept in the front room. Now I was awake for none of this, so everything I've heard is second hand. Apparently one of my brothers, who was 6 or 7 at the time, walked out the room and into the hall, not waking up until he was halfway down it. Thank God a nice young couple found him and soon woke him up. Since he couldn't remember the room number, they took him down to the front desk, and the night manager was able to look up my parents' names and bring him back up to the correct room. I really hate thinking, what could have happened if the wrong person had found him? My strict, no-nonsense mum was a bus driver for a tough inner-city high school, and I had the ride with her after a doctor's appointment one day. I have more stories than just this. 2 boys of 17 or 18 started fighting in the back of the bus, and started pulling knives, and I just shook my head. I knew what was going to happen. She pulled over, marched back, grabbed those kids, and tossed them out the bus, without the bat of an eye. The knives were confiscated by my mum and authorities contacted. At least most of the cargo truckers pull can't fight back. She taught me so much about respecting big rigs, buses and vehicles on the road when learning to drive. Give them space, respect their blind spots. These rigs need room, so if you see one trying to turn, give them some wiggle room. And don't pull up to the line, and just know that some of them are driving a stick shift. I can't thank her enough. Everyone, wear your damn seatbelt. This happened in around 2004 or 5, when I was 14 or 15. I had a paper round, and part of the round included a small path by the side of the local high school. It wasn't very well used or lit, but it cut at least 20 minutes off my route. Not a problem in summer, but autumn/winter, it was going to be dark by 4, so I just used to run up there really quick, as I could get back on the main road where it's more well lit. I did this for a year without incident, so never really felt bothered by this, until one day, I see this guy by the path's entrance. He was tall and skinny, bald, and his eyes were quite sunken. He gave me the creeps, but he never said anything to me, so I didn't think much of it. I ran up the path to the main road and carried on with my route as usual. A few days later I saw him again, coming out of the house that is on the same street as the path entrance. So again I didn't really think much of it, and just carried on. After that, I used to see him all the time skulking around. Whatever time I went out to do my route, he'd be there, morning and night. It really bothered me, but I didn't tell anyone because I didn't want him to think I was exaggerating. The final straw was one day when he started following me, so I started to run, and so did he. Luckily, I managed to knock on someone's door who saw how distraught I was, who let me in to calm down. I phoned my dad, who came to pick me up, and we drove down the road that he lived on. I pointed his house out, so my dad went and knocked on the door and asked what the hell he thought he was playing at. He answered the door, saw my dad, and bolted. My dad, to those who don't know him, would see him as very intimidating because he's tall, well built, has tattoos, a bald head and a beard. My dad chased after him up the pathway where he liked to stalk me, and when he never came back a few minutes later, he got back in the car and told me that he would never bother me again. I don't know what happened when my dad caught up to him, but thanks to my dad, I never had to cross paths with my stalker again. I passed an accident on I-240 in Memphis a few years ago. My dad was in my passenger seat, and we were in the northbound lanes. In the southbound lane, pressed against the driver, was a white Ford F-150 and about 6 police cars behind it. The Ford was smashed to shit. As we got closer to the accident, I noticed a body hanging out of the driver's window, covered in a blanket. The arms stretched out from under the blanket, and blood was smeared along the side of the white truck. It was a miserable scene. My dad was messing with his phone at the time, and he noticed me slow down slightly as we passed this wreck, and he started to look up. I said, "No, Dad, don't look," but it was too late. He saw the body and the blood, and we drove in silence the whole way home. It was a somber experience. Neither of us talked about it again. Wear your seatbelts, people. Not me, but my friend and a friend of his went backpacking around Ukraine about 10 years ago. My friend has told me a story about a haunted hotel he experienced there a couple of times. It wasn't in one of the major cities. I think it was more in the countryside. They couldn't find the hotel they'd originally intended to stay in, but they found this other place. When they checked in, the 2 girls behind the counter seemed to confer and giggled as they handed him a big old key that didn't look like any of the other keys hanging up. It led to a room that seemed isolated from the other guest rooms in the building. Various weird things happened to them that night. I think it started with the taps in the ensuite randomly turning on when they were trying to sleep. Eventually the showers started coming on full blast. There was laughter and knocks, and my friend got a phone call from a Ukrainian number on his mobile, even though he hadn't given his number to anyone since entering the country. When he answered, the other end hung up. The next morning, when the housekeeping maid came in, she insisted that my 2 friends stay in the room as she cleaned. She did a very quick and cursory job, was all anxious and all blessing herself basically. Bear in mind at this point, my friend and his pal weren't entertaining any thought of this being anything paranormal. They're not that way minded at all. They just thought these things were a bit weird. So when they went downstairs to check in for a second night, the 2 receptionist girls were amazed, basically incredulous, asking, "Are you sure?" It was only when they went for a walk around the locale after lunch that they put everything together and swiftly cancelled their stay after freaking out and finding somewhere else. The next day, after they left, there was a tree outside the hotel with a cat in it. The cat seemed to disintegrate before their eyes. I can't remember whether or not that was another thing that made them decide for sure to check out, or if it happened as they were leaving when they checked out already. I suppose the obvious explanation is that they were having a joke played on them, but that doesn't explain the phone thing, and there was no access to the ensuite apart from through their room. My parents bought their first house back in 1972. It was a fixer-upper, but they decided to move in right away and fix things as time and money permitted. Within a few days of moving in, the new neighbours came over to introduce themselves. They also let my parents know that the previous owners had moved out after a nasty divorce. They had lost their second baby from SIDS, and their relationship went downhill from there. My parents were horrified, more so because they were newly pregnant and couldn't imagine going through such a thing. They eventually pretty much forgot about it, and life went on. They were in love with their new life and their new home. In preparation for the baby, they decided to wallpaper the nursery. Now my dad told my mum there was no need in wallpapering the inside closet, but she insisted. She was kneeling down, scraping off old paint inside, when her eyes fell upon something that made her blood turn to ice. Written in crayon, about the eye level for a kindergartner, in childish scrawl was written, "I killed the baby." So this week, I headed up to London for a few days. I caught the train, and the journey takes a while, so I booked a table seat so that I could get some work done. I put on my headphones and got out my laptop. At the start of the journey, I have all 4 seats to myself. At the next stop, an older man of about 60-ish gets on, with a massive bacon baguette. This is important later, and sits opposite me. The train was less than half full, with lots of empty tables, as it was off-peak, but the guy decided to sit opposite me. Okay, a bit odd, but I didn't think much of it. A few minutes later, the guy starts trying to make conversation with me. I take my headphones off, and he says, "Will it offend you if I eat the bacon sandwich in front of you?" I'm slightly confused, but then realize that my laptop is covered in a vegan sticker, one of which being my business. Nothing too graphic. More love them, don't eat them, adopt, don't shop, and things like that. I respond with, "No, go ahead," and put my headphones on. He tries to talk to me a few times, but I quickly shut it down, politely, as I'm wanting to get my work done. He was asking where I was going, who I was meeting, and this was setting alarm bells off. I told him a different location to where I was heading, and I was getting bad vibes by this point. I get off the train and power walk to the tube, losing him, but still looking over my shoulder, slightly freaked out by this taking the slightly longer route to where I was going. I forget it by the end of the day, and that evening I check my phone, and I have a friend request on Facebook, as mine is on super lockdown, and a few messages from what looks like this guy. I'm like, what the hell? How did he find me? And why is he adding me? I blocked and deleted him. Now I hear you say this is the end of the story. But no! I get home 2 days later and start telling my husband about creepy train guy. And he is also like, what the hell? The guy also tried adding him and messaging him. So how did this guy find me? I never gave him my name. My business is not linked to my Facebook. And how could he have known which one was mine when I have around 10 stickers on there? My dad is a truck driver and called me really upset one morning about 7 years ago, saying a girl my age, as I was 16, was knocking on his window at 5:10, barefoot and obviously high. She had little to no teeth and hadn't seemed to have bathed in weeks. She was begging for my dad to let her perform sexual services on him in exchange for $10. It made him so upset that he bought her a hot chocolate and a sandwich, gave her his blanket from his truck, and $50, and really hoped she wouldn't use it on drugs. I guess he thought of me when he saw her. I don't know. It really shook him.